Hello and welcome to this edition of Staff Talk. This week we're handling the question, were there dinosaurs on the Ark? And as always, we kind of give you a little background from the book. This week's chapter starts with a child asking a question of the Bible. He says, forcing his parents to do some thinking. He said, a woman wrote Adam recently and asked the question put to her by her daughter. Mommy, her daughter asked, were there dinosaurs on the Ark? All right, and so what do you think?
Well, I think as you read more into the chapter, you realize that this is so much more than were there dinosaurs on the Ark. Because looking back, like the course of history, we know dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago, so a while ago.
Yeah, and humans didn't show up till about 200,000 years ago.
200,000 years ago, which we talked about last week when we talked about Adam and Eve. So the timelines don't line up, and so, I mean, yes, there were dinosaurs, but it wasn't possible for them to be on the Ark. But like I said, this conversation is way more than just that.
So in some ways, in the span of who we are as Christians, from the most fundamental to the most liberal, you're forced to do one of two things: either blindly just take that it's not there, and it's not there because God didn't have to give us everything, and it's true and accurate and perfect. Or you can step back from it a little bit and go, okay, did it happen exactly like this? I don't know, but is it true? Yes, it is, because it talks about the human condition. It talks about the way God interacts with humanity, and it has a lot to teach us about who we are and who God is in the midst of that. And so I wonder, how does it make you, when you read that story, how does it make you feel about God?
Well, I mean, so you're reading the story of Noah, right? And then God gets really kind of frustrated with his people and wants to smite out a whole generation of people locally there around Noah. And so you get kind of like, oh my goodness, this is overwhelming. God could just do this, right? But I don't know.
It's interesting because before we even start this part, though, when we went to CORE a few years ago, there was the guy who said, as my theology becomes more complex, my faith becomes more simple. So just because you're getting into this complex, did it happen and who was there and everything else, doesn't mean that you have to have less faith.
Absolutely.
Right. And I think that's kind of a big point when we're talking about all of these things, because it's is it literal, is it not literal, is it, that kind of stuff. And so you don't have to line them up exactly side by side.
Well, and we know that that there's stories of flood stories and other,
right.
the epics of Gilgamesh talk about a flood story, and some other people. But we also know from anthropologists and archaeologists that it doesn't seem like the entire Earth was ever really covered with water. So I often, when people, you got to remember, the people that are writing this at the time thought the world was flat.
Yeah.
And so their world wasn't particularly big, and so I can imagine that the world as they knew it was flooded.
Well, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have phones,
Yeah.
they didn't have ways to communicate.
As far as they could see and go, and I think the important part of the story is that we can find some historical evidence for an ark, the found parts of it, and so we do believe there was an ark. We do believe there was. I do believe there was a flood. I'm not sure it covered the entire earth, but I think it covered the entire world that Noah knew. And and if you get caught up in whether there were dinosaurs or whether there were 7 pairs of birds or whether tigers, that's, I think you lose the meaning, and
right.
you get it, but it's easy in the early part of your faith, or at least it was in mine, to get bogged down in that stuff because you're told that there's something about the Bible that I couldn't particularly swallow, that it was completely factual. And the thing is nothing. It doesn't have to be factually true. If you don't believe that, just turn to your Old Testament and see what Jesus has to say. He's teaching constantly about stories that had no basis in reality, but taught about a deeper truth. And so I don't know why we would think the Jewish people of the day would be stuck to facts all the time when they're trying to tell you something about who they are and who God is in their life. One of my seminary professors once said that the Bible is the faithful account of the people of God, of God's revelation to them.
The kids' version of that is it's a book about God's people for God's people.
Exactly.
Yeah. It doesn't mean it's literal.
And God speaks to us in our time and our way. And so it's really interesting that as God, one of the things that we don't talk about in this story a lot is the idea that humans have gotten so bad, and some people think that it's some scholars talk about this idea that with the advent of language and higher thinking and art and all these things, also came the invent of weapons. And we don't know why the Neanderthals went extinct, but a lot of people think it was because the higher thinking humans had better weapons, were able to wipe them out. And so God sees us, using our ingenuity, our creativity to hurt each other, and it hurts his heart. And I had a hard time feeling that until I read an example in here where they talked about one of the mothers of one of the Columbine shootings, and she said she grieved and grieved and grieved because she didn't know how something that she helped make could cause such suffering and destruction. And I thought, oh gosh, that's just a fraction of how God must have felt. Right. And so another thing that I think is important for us to think about here is that the Bible doesn't say everything all the time. And some people will say, well, that's just God gives us what we need to know and don't bother about the rest. But the Jewish people, I think, are a little more pragmatic about this. They have this a mechanism called midrash, and it's simply a way of filling in the gaps. And to give you an idea of a good example of a midrash, if you've ever seen the movie Noah. Right. In the movie Noah, there are these rock creatures. What did you say the name?
It's something, I don't know.
It's like,
lithium. Anyway, so these rock creatures, and they help they protect Noah, and they help him build the ark. Yeah. And some fundamental Christians, were up in arms when the movie came out because they're like, that's not in the Bible. That's not in the Bible. Well, when you talk to the writers and all that, they actually found that from a Jewish midrash. And what a Jewish midrash is where the Jewish people argue and they come up with this idea and they fill in the gaps that the Bible leaves. And so there's a Jewish midrash that talks about these creatures that help build. And so this guy didn't just make these things up out of nowhere. They came from a Jewish tradition where we get our Old Testament from. And there are tons of midrashes. Some are written, some are oral, but they're a way of wrestling with the text. And I guess one of the things I find most interesting about this is one of those you have to kind of wrestle with, because if you don't get the deeper meaning, and it's harder.
I would challenge you to go back and read the story.
Absolutely, yeah. Adam even says that here. He says, go back and read it for yourself, and don't focus on how long the ark was or how many of this was. Think about how the story makes you feel, how it might make God feel, how you interact with the story.
Well, and I think a lot of people don't read it. They've read it when they were a kid,
and they know
they know what we taught them.
Yeah.
So that's 2 by 2.
I don't need to read that story because I've heard it over and over again.
I've heard it a million times in children's ministry. Well, it's not the whole story.
Yeah, and there's so many little nuances that you know. But I can assure you, there's no mention of dinosaurs.
No.
And I don't think, from what we know scientifically, they will add up. Now there will be some. They said there was a kid that stood up in a church and preached there were dinosaurs on the ark, and I'd like to hear that because I don't know where his evidence comes from.
That would be good. Yeah.
But there were times in my life, I guess when I was younger, when I had to try to do those mental gymnastics to make all this line up, or else I had to throw the Bible out.
Right.
And the wonderful thing is you don't, because it doesn't have to always be factually accurate historically to teach the historical love and grace and of God. Second chance. What it does when we kill each other, hurt each other. There's a wonderful quote. I won't read it in here, but there's a wonderful quote from Eisenhower in the 50s talking about how the money we spend on war. He compares it to what we could do, like building schools or feeding thousands of people with one bomb. We could feed this many people with one warship. We could build this many houses. And he says that this is the only way we can live in our modern world because of the way it's in. But he says it's no way at all. He says it's actually, he compares it to us living on an iron cross and of our war. And he talks about that idea of making God unhappy or hurting God's feelings. And so I guess I would just encourage you to read the story again. We don't have all the answers. This has been a harder one for us, I think, as we talked about what we wanted to say. So, read it for yourself, make your own decision. And always, our opinions are just our opinions.
Yes.
And
they're not the views.
They're like elbows. Everybody has a couple.
Yes. Mine may change over the years.
Yeah,
some are rough. No. So anyway, if you have questions, as always, feel free to call us. This is sort of our just staff study time together, something we wanted to do for a long time, and having to bring it to you each week kind of makes us do it. So, because we're bad about not finding time. So, thanks for being with us today as we talk about this story.
Well, okay, so next week we're going to look at something just a little more, could be slightly controversial, I don't know, but God's violence in the Old Testament. Yeah, there were times when like
50,000?
Yeah, God, smited a whole land of people, or got rid of a whole city or just
ordered the Israelites to do the killing.
And so talking about violence in the Old Testament is pretty deep. It's going to get really interesting for sure.
And I think, just as a preview, this is one of the things that Adam has the most difficulty with. I remember him talking about this before, and so we look forward to next week and talking to you.
Reconciling the God of the Old Testament
with
and the New Testament.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hope y'all are doing great, and we miss you all, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.